I'm Ian O'Toole. I run the Kurrajong Radio Museum, which is a museum devoted to past radio technology. We start off in the early 1900s and go up to about 1980. The Kurrajong Radio Museum has a very, very extensive collection of radios. It's not just domestic, it's not just military or commercial or professional, it's the whole lot. There is broadcast studio, broadcast transmitters, all the studio equipment. There's a lot of history and a lot of radios in here. The museum has, I think, around 800 radios. I really don't count them. I'm interested in the technology and how they work, and other people come in, they're interested in the number, the vast number of them. And all of my friends, they go around and count them, but that really doesn't. That's not the appeal. The number's not the appeal. It's what they are. People will come in and say, "Have you got such and such a set?" And I'll say yes, and "Oh, where is it?" And I'll go up and show it to them, and they think, "Wow." But yeah, I know everything that's in here. I started with electronics with a crystal set in 1955 when I was still at primary school, and this crystal set had a defect. It didn't have a knob on the tuning gang, which meant that you had to hold onto the shaft of the tuning condenser to keep it on station. If you took your hand away, the station disappeared. So I had to spend 2 and 6pence and buy a knob to insulate the shaft. And that led me to find where the local radio shop was, and the rest of it's history. It was very hard to start with, and this is one of the problems with radio, particularly amateur radio in particular, in that it's a closed communication circle. If you're outside the circle, it's very difficult to find out, how to start. But I was lucky because my parents owned a news agency, and they had all the world's magazines, and one was beautiful Australian magazine was called Radio and Hobbies at that stage. It later became Radio, Television and Hobbies. And by reading that, you could teach yourself electronics. When I first started, I actually came in through radio hams. I used to wait until someone would buy the Radio and Hobbies in the newspaper shop, and then I'd talk to them about the projects. And they were all the local hams, and that's how I got to know them. And they taught me early valve theory, and that really got me started. If it wasn't for them, I probably wouldn't be here today doing this. I went straight into building radios. From the crystal set to a 1-valve radio is not a really big step, and you go 2-valve. And then after that, it got a bit harder because you couldn't keep buying batteries. So you had to eventually go to mains radios, and they're 240 volts. And when you're young, you can make mistakes. I know one day I walked out, left the radio running, and came back, and the whole room was full of smoke. And it took about 6 months for the smell to go away. So these are the things that happen. Yeah, the hams and the hobbyists were a really mixed bunch of people. They really cover the whole of society. I was talking to people who were the head of enormous organisations, and you'd talk to other people, and they had jobs of much lower social status. But they were all there together, and they all knew one another basically by their first name or call sign. You never asked what the person did. That was just that was what was so beautiful about ham radio, that you were treated all as equals. Yeah, getting components was difficult when you didn't have any money. I think anything's difficult. But as a young boy, the best source of components was old radios that people threw out. And unfortunately, they weren't new. They were pretty old, and there was 1920s, 1930s components that you would build things out of. And most people in those days didn't have a lot of money to spare. And even the amateurs, they'd build recycled bits and pieces. In the early 50s, there was a lot of wartime radio around, and that equipment was used by hams either as it was, or they highly modified it. And a lot of the equipment in the museum here is actually, if it hadn't been for the hams, this would have gone to the dump years ago. But it's all here. My first project was a crystal set, and I didn't actually have to build it. I bought it already built, but it had a whole lot of failings, and I eventually fiddled around and got it going a lot better. Then I went on to just 1 or 2 valve sets using battery valves, which meant you had to buy 1.5 volt batteries, 45 volt batteries. You couldn't electrocute yourself. It was fun, but you could burn the filament out, which was dangerous because they were about £1.10 for each valve. Well, having access to components when you first start is pretty crucial to get you past the starting point. And that's the problem today, because we're now in a throwaway society. People just throw all their electronics away. It's harder to get components. Yes, the main source of components was other people's rubbish. And if you lived near the garbage tip, you were right, because you could always go and pull all of the old bits out of things. But my main source of components was out of military gear. That was not, some of it was not readily adaptable to any civilian use, so you could buy it for virtually next to nothing, and you'd take the resistors and the capacitors and the valves out of that, and that was what you built your projects out of. If you couldn't find or swap, you had to go to the shop, and in Newcastle the shop was Martin Delaunay's, and you'd have to pay real money when you went in there, and that was all new stuff, and we used to think the shop was magic. I used to do my radio with two brothers that I was at high school with, and we'd often be in the shop, and in those days, if you had an amateur radio licence, we didn't have one, but the two brothers, Thomas and Duncan, their father had a great friend called Leo, whose call sign was VK2QB. And if you went into Martin Delaunay and said it was for VK2QB, you got 17.5% sales tax off, which was really good. But we went in there one day and said it's for VK2QB, and the bloke in the counter said, "That's funny, he's standing behind you." When Dick Smith first opened and put all the components on display, that was just incredible. You could walk in and have a look to see what they had. The other shops, everything, it was just a counter, what do you want? But you could just go and pick what you wanted. It was really great. Oh, you'd often, well, if things were cheap, you'd often say, "Oh, I might use that." So you buy those sorts of things. But yeah, you often ended up with a lot of stuff that you didn't need, but it was all reasonably cheap, and eventually you'll use it. You'll know the minute you throw something away, you'll need it tomorrow. Now, there is a lot of military equipment in here, because I started out as a military radio collector, and that's what I'm basically known as, a military radio collector, although I collect a lot of other things, and a lot of other areas I collect in. I probably have one of the best collections in Australia in each of them. So, yes, collecting military radios was just a matter of saving up your money and making a big trip to Sydney. And there were several shops in Oxford Street. There was Ace Radio at Marrickville. We soon got to know all the haunts, and you'd just go there and you'd be recognised by the people who owned the shop, and they'd often ring up if they had something special in. They knew I'd buy it. But yeah, that was the basic source. In the 1960s, previous to that there had been too, but there were lots of jobs in electronics, and I always wanted to go into electronics, but the way it worked out, I didn't. I went into teaching. I could have gone into electronics, but I think I would have changed jobs many, many times and wouldn't have had a job at the end. Yeah, there are lots of opportunities for employment in radio. I get people coming to the museum quite often that have worked in the industry. Probably 15% of my visitors are ex the industry, and ex is the word. I get very few in that actually work in the industry, because most of the jobs have now gone. As a hobbyist, yes, the number of radio magazines have dropped, but with the membership of amateur radio, we had a decline after the internet came online, but now the Department of Communications, or ACMA as it is now, they've changed. There's a new licence level, it's called F-class licence. You don't need Morse code anymore, and the FCall licence is at a much reduced technical standard, so there's been quite an increase in the number of hams coming on the air. So in that way, yes, there has been an increase in the hobby, but I guess overall it's now cheaper just to go and buy things, so there probably aren't as many electronic tinkerers around. It's easy to buy something and throw it away if it breaks and buy another one, rather than the old days. You paid hard money for something. If it broke, you fixed it. Probably not so much of that now, but if you do like fixing things, you go around to council clean-up day and you've got enough to last 12 months. Amateur radio has actually changed. In the olden days, most people built their equipment. These days, a lot of people just buy the transceivers because they're now extremely complex. It's not like the old days. It's not AM. It's single sideband and a lot of other modes. You can actually buy radios that have got GPSs and things like that in them now. But there are still the hardcore tinkerers in amateur radio. And because Morse is no longer a requirement to take out a call sign, Morse has also had a resurgence simply because you don't have to have it anymore. So that's going. There's been a great resurgence in AM. If you'd come on the air 15 years ago, people would say, is there something wrong with your transmitter? You've got a carrier. Is it broken? Which, of course, AM has a carrier and two sidebands. Normal operation is single sideband, which is one sideband and no carrier. But with interest in old things and things that you can actually get in and fix, AM has now had a big resurgence. Now, there's probably more AM stations on now than there have been since 1960. In the future, I think we're going to see a lot more of the digital modes. A lot of the existing systems will probably disappear. Some of the transmission modes, like AM on the broadcast band, I think that's going to stay. There are a lot of radio systems around that are very, very difficult to change, like aircraft radio, which is AM on VHF. That'll probably stay. But I think there's just going to be an increase in the digital modes. I really think that, with all this increase in digital modes and that, it's going to become much more complex, but probably much more exciting. The problem is we won't be able to build as much ourselves. It's going to get cheaper. We're going to get probably more value for our money, but we're not going to be able to fix a lot of the equipment. Radio museums are pretty sparse. There aren't that many of them in the world, and I get a lot of visitors here from overseas who are absolutely amazed at what's in here, and of course they've got their yardsticks with the overseas museums, but I guess the museum keeps going as long as people keep visiting it. And the hardest part of running a radio museum is convincing people that they need to come and have a look at it. Most of my advertising is word of mouth with groups that actually come in. And I get a lot of people come in who are quite unsure of what they're going to find. But I often note they'll send back a whole group, so I'm getting somewhere with it.